questions. But anyway, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Hennessey. I am a regional manager for backcountry hunters and anglers. I'll kind of be the host here tonight. I'll play a little role in the program as well. This program is called the Savvy Conservationist, and this one is focused on understanding funding for conservation in Pennsylvania. This series was started by Pennsylvania backcountry hunters and anglers because we felt there was a need for folks in PA to understand conservation a little bit better, the nuts and bolts, how it works. I think we all sort of know why conservation is important, or at least most of us on this call do, because it keeps it helps us have places to hunt and fish. It keeps them clean and green, fresh air and water. But I don't think the idea was that a lot of people might not know how all this works, like what the mechanisms are. So we wanted to start this series up in sort of a learning 101, pretty basic series to cover those things. So thank you for being here, and I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to introduce the other panelists, and then we'll kick off. We're hoping to cover three major areas of funding on this call, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, you can put them either use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, or you can drop them in the chat, and we'll circle back to all those in the last 15 minutes or so and try to get your questions answered. So again, my name is Chris Hennessey. I'm a regional manager for backcountry hunters and anglers. I live in State College, Pennsylvania. I'm a lifelong hunter, angler, backpacker, general all-around outdoors person. I've worked in conservation here in Pennsylvania for more than a decade, and I've been with BHA for 4 years. I guess she's below me on the panel. Maybe she is for everyone. I don't know. Samantha Petter is VP of Marketing for Terra Technology. She has a decade of experience working for state fish and wildlife agencies, trade associations, and national nonprofits on participation in hunting, shooting, angling, and boating, and the impacts those things have on funding for resource management. She's kind of a pro. She volunteers at her alma mater, which I believe is, you're talking about Penn State? Mm-hmm. Volunteers at Penn State to train new biologists and foresters. She serves in the national leadership team for Artemis Sportswomen. And most importantly, is a board member of the Pennsylvania chapter of BHA. She has been with us for 2 years. And needless to say, she's an avid hunter and angler and outdoor woman. And to her left is John Klein. John is the ramrod at Klein Associates in Harrisburg. He has more than 20 years experience working in education, advocacy, and policy for the outdoors, hunting, fishing, and conservation. He works with BHA Pennsylvania in an official capacity on outreach efforts, membership growth, and educating the public and policymakers about BHA's public lands mission. He's a lifelong hunter, angler, and sports shooter, and is handy enough with a pistol to be a certified instructor. Still have that certification? Okay, he does. To my over here is Derek Eberly. Derek is the outgoing Pennsylvania field rep for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, which is a great organization that BHA is a member of. We do a lot of good work with TRCP across the country. Derek has worked on conservation funding and clean water advocacy issues affecting the sportsman's community in Pennsylvania for the last 3 years with TRCP. He's also a fly fishing guide, a certified casting instructor, and a former board member of Donegal Trout Unlimited here in Pennsylvania. He is the current vice president of conservation for the Chesapeake Council of the Federation of Fly Fishers. He lives in Lancaster, but he fishes all across the Commonwealth. Thank you for being here, everyone. Appreciate it. I'm going to take a minute to tell folks about BHA because I don't know if everyone is familiar. Hey, where'd my slides go? Hold on. There we go. You guys can see that, right? Yeah. Take a minute to tell you about BHA. BHA, here's the logo. It's Voice for Our Wild Public Lands, Waters, and Wildlife. BHA was founded in Oregon in 2004. We're now headquartered in Montana. We have chapters now covering 48 states and 4 provinces and territories in Canada. We have about 40,000 members. Our members are primarily hunters and anglers, but there are others who just appreciate the public lands message and advocacy and work we do on public lands who are also members. The thing that makes BHA a little different than other sort of sportsmen's groups is the public lands focus. We very narrowly stick to that. And we also have a young, politically diverse, and very active member base. Our folks can be found in capitals all across the country, in Washington, D.C., and they can be found hunting and fishing in all kinds of places all over North America. Our issues primarily come from these 3 buckets: access and opportunity to hunting and fishing, public lands and waters. That means maintaining public land and places to fish for the public, making sure that they're there, that they're in good shape, and that we have access. And then fair chase is a 3rd bucket. Fair chase is a 3rd bucket. That's a little bit about hunting ethics and making sure that not only other hunters, but the quarry is not put at great disadvantage in the process. That's probably the thing that we work on least because it's such a judgment call. But once in a while, there are things that we engage on in the fair chase area. Let's see, one more slide. Access and opportunity is really, really important to us, and it's sort of the reason we're talking about what we're talking about on this call is the funding for conservation keeps public land and really all land, private land too, in a lot of cases, open for hunting and fishing and other outdoor rec. In survey after survey shown that lack of access to places to hunt and fish and do other types of recreation is the #1 reason that people get out of those activities. So keeping access easy and abundant is an important thing to holding on to having hunters and anglers and others out there fighting for public lands. Fishing and other outdoor recreation also suffer from changes in ownership, management, or sale. As things change with property ownership, not necessarily public land, but private land too, those things can also get, suffer from access issues. So those are all things that BHA works on, is one of our primary focuses. And wanted to share that before we jumped into the program. So that's the end of my slides and my introduction. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Klein to talk to us about the agencies.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chris, and welcome everybody. We're really glad that you're here. As Chris said at the top, these some of the things we may be talking about may seem elementary to you, but it's very important in our view, from Backcountry's view, that folks in our world, I call it all the time, understand things beyond just the pursuits that we engage in. They're fun, they're great, they're traditional, it's very exciting, but I don't have to tell anybody that you all know that we live in an environment where politics and policy affect virtually every walk of life and everything that we do. And hunting, fishing, the outdoors, and public land is no different. Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is a terrific organization that really is looking out for those of us that engage in these pursuits. Access is very, very important. Public lands, obviously, very, very important, and fair chase, just the same. But access, as Chris said, is something that we work on in Harrisburg with policymakers. And no matter what you may think, that whatever pursuit you have, whether it's the outdoors like all of us engage in or not, people in state, local, and federal government have an impact on what you do through laws and even more so through regulation. So, there are three primary regulatory agencies in Pennsylvania that those of us who engage in hunting, fishing, trapping, outdoor activities, those three agencies you're either going to run into from time to time, or have some interaction with, whether it's licensing or who controls the land that you're on. We're very, very fortunate in Pennsylvania to have nearly 4 million acres of public land, and that includes state forests, state game lands, many parks that are open to hunting, fishing, and other outdoor pursuits, as well as conservancy land. You're going to hear a little bit more about that later on from Chris. But a recent survey showed that some of the most important things for items for those of us that hunt and fish and engage in sportsmanlike activities are ethics and the tradition. I know that everybody on the panel here is originally from Pennsylvania, and we know how important that is to each and every one of us. We all have our own stories. I grew up in a family, although my dad didn't hunt, I grew up around people that did, and I eventually got into that activity, drew my brother in, and a lot of others, and have had a wonderful time during my entire life. But back to those three agencies, very, very important. The first one is the Pennsylvania Game Commission. The second is the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. And the third is the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, DCNR. So again, these are basic things that I think it's important for everybody to understand. And when it comes to funding these agencies, I think a lot of folks don't understand, how this works. Where does my license money go? Does the state pay for this? Does tax money go for this or that? I can tell you that starting with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, they have three funding sources, primarily hunting and fishing licenses, hunting and fur taking licenses, which accounts for about half of their budget, which last fiscal year was about $114 million. Timber, mineral sales and revenue, and then also very, very important piece is the federal excise tax on firearms, ammunition, and other outdoor equipment. You're going to hear a little bit more about that. You'll hear this term Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson. You're like, oh, what in the world does that mean? These are the people that were most important in getting these acts at the federal level passed, which created an excise tax on certain pieces of equipment that we all use. And that money then is distributed back to states. And there's a formula that's used, and without sounding too wonky, it's very, very important that formula is the amount of people that are licensed to hunt or fish. So, I've told many friends over the years that even if you don't hunt or fish, the best thing you can do for conservation in Pennsylvania is to buy a hunting license or buy a fishing license, because that money goes directly to the agency. The Game Commission does not receive any general fund revenue, that is taxes. Pennsylvania just passed a $40 billion budget for the next fiscal year. The Game Commission doesn't get any of that money, and it's for its operating fund. Fish and Boat Commission operates very, very similar as far as revenue streams. They get license money from fishing licenses. They get license money from boating registration, and also the Dingle Johnson money from that's that federal excise tax that we talked about. Pennsylvania is very, very unique because the Pennsylvania Game Commission and the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission are separate agencies. Most states have a Division of Natural Resources, for example, that houses both of those agencies. The Game Commission was set up in 1895, and they're structured the way they are in Pennsylvania for very, very specific reasons. Even though I started this talk by reminding you that everything we do has some political connection, the folks who were very wise in setting up these agencies many years ago realized that. That's why they don't get any tax money, because that keeps interests outside of conservation and sportsmen's activities further away from what the Game Commission's charge is and what the Fish and Boat Commission's charge is. So it's important that there be some insulation. It's true they are state agencies, but they don't have the Fish and Boat Commission and the Game Commission don't have a direct solid line to the legislature or the governor, for that matter, the way that other executive agencies do. DCNR, for example, the Secretary of DCNR is a cabinet member, reports directly to the governor, to the executive, and that's the way that's set up. Very, very important. So the DCNR receives a significant portion of its revenue through the general fund. That's tax money that you and I pay as Pennsylvanians. Also through other sources, licensing, park and cabin rentals, various fees. One of the things that's unique about DCNR, unique in a way that it's so much larger than Fish and Boat or Game, is that it has an enormous infrastructure that it has to maintain every year. So it costs a lot of money. And what I mean by that is, of all the state parks across the Commonwealth, many of them have their own sewage systems, lakes, dams, water systems, buildings. So it costs a lot of money to maintain those operations and to pay the people that do that. So when you look at these three agencies, Game Commission, Fish and Boat Commission, and DCNR, the Game Commission is set up with a board of commissioners. Fish and Boat Commission set up in a very similar way. DCNR is set up with the secretary that reports directly to the governor. And I go back to the beginning, these three agencies are critically important to you and to us as members of backcountry hunters and anglers, because these are the three primary agencies that oversee public lands and access to public lands. Backcountry works all the time, constantly in Pennsylvania and all its other chapters to make sure that that access is open and easy for all of us to get and to continue to share with our family and our friends. So the next time you think about buying a hunting license, remember that's the primary source of revenue for the Game Commission. Same thing with a fishing license. Pennsylvania boasts nearly more than 800,000 people that hunt, and about the same, if not higher, number of people that fish. And one thing that we've learned through the recent pandemic is that more and more of us, and I'm sure all of you that are participating in this webinar, have been able to do and wanted to do for a long time, is to get in the outdoors and enjoy the outdoors more. There's been a spike in fishing licenses and that activity. So that's great that it's driving up the revenue for this organization to operate, but also, a lot of costs are incurred at the same time. So that's very, very important to remember. In the case of DCNR, next time you go to a state park, which are free, by the way, to attend or to access in almost all cases, keep that in mind. Keep in mind as well that the secretary of DCNR has to go before the legislature, both the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee, to review the budget and request the amount needed to effectively run that operation, and it is enormous. Another unique item with regard to DCNR is these parks that I mentioned that we're all happy to enjoy here as Pennsylvanians. A lot of that infrastructure that I said is so big is also aging. So there is a great need now more than ever to consider helping DCNR with state revenue, whether it's tax, general fund revenue or other sources. So that's critically important. Fish and Boat has those kinds of expenses. So does game, and not nearly to the size of DCNR. So these three agencies, it is most likely that all of us that enjoy the outdoors will run into either a game warden, a fish commission officer, or a park ranger with DCNR. These are the people that are on the ground that all of us will somehow run into, whatever we're doing. But keep in mind, people like me and Chris and those of us that work in Harrisburg on behalf of backcountry are advocating to keep our these service agencies healthy and strong, because their charter is to provide provide access to wild spaces and public lands to all Pennsylvanians, all 13 million Pennsylvanians. Just because the four of us on this panel hunt, fish, and perhaps trap, that's fine. But every single Pennsylvania is entitled to that. So the funding mechanisms for these agencies are unique. If you engage in the outdoors, this is the message that I want to leave with you. If you engage in outdoor activities, particularly hunting, fishing, trapping, and the like, you're participating directly in that. You have a voice. Consider backcountry as your voice in Harrisburg. We work very hard to make sure that that's maintained. So I thank you, and I don't know if any of the other panelists have any other comments they want to make with regard to the agencies.
Yeah, one thing I'll say is that there are many states where you can't just walk in any state park for free. There's a little kiosk in the front, and you have to stop and pay by the carload.
Right.
And I was in Florida recently, and I think at one of the parks, I think they hit us for like $9 a car or something. So it's, when you consider how many times in a year I might go to a state park, it's a lot of bucks, and it's a great benefit to the people of Pennsylvania and people from other states as well. So
I think I'll add to that. John, correct me if I'm wrong, or Sam or Chris, but I think DCNR said their goal is to have a state park or state land within what is it, John, like 20 minutes or 30 minutes?
The late Dr. Goddard, that was his dream back in the 70s, was to have state park within 25 miles, no more than 25 miles from every Pennsylvanian, and we're just about there. It's absolutely remarkable.
Yeah.
To know.
So when you think about it, like I've got two kids. I got an 8 and an 11-year-old. Definitely don't want them in front of screens all the time. I live in Lancaster. I have a ton of public land thanks to DCNR and the Game Commission and the Fish Commission. I have a ton of state land and public access to public waterways to within 15 minutes of my house. So but that further highlights how expansive and how big the responsibilities of these agencies are.
Right. And just to close out my piece, again, a reminder for the participants that call that these agencies, primarily Game Commission and Fish and Boat, do not receive any tax revenue. So that's really remarkable. And if you are watching this webinar and you purchase a hunting license or a fishing license, be proud, because you're helping to maintain and operate these agencies.
That's great. Thank you, John. Mr. Eberly, you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm going to keep mine short. And I think short and simple so that we can get to questions. Although I don't want to steal John's thunder, but remember, as an angler or a hunter or a boater, it's your job to play in Pennsylvania, because that's what maintains these places. So I always kind of joke. My brother always picked on me for being the guy that was always playing instead of working. Luckily, your job is to play in Pennsylvania. If you're a hunter or an angler or a boater, get out there and play, because that's what's helping to pay for these places that we all enjoy. So I guess just go to my plain vanilla slides here, Chris, if you can cue them up. I should have found like a fancy graphic or something to add to them. And just as a means of reintroducing, my name is Derek Everly. I'm the Pennsylvania field representative of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I don't know, are the slides showing? Or would I know if the slides are showing? Chris, you are so on mute right now. Can't hear anything.
We're having a technical difficulty with your slides. They're set on slideshow, and I can't control that.
Oh my God.
So you
What
have
should
them
I
there,
do?
right? You have them there, right?
Yeah.
So just go down to the bottom of the screen and hit share screen, and then you'll get to pick which screen. This is on the fly Zoom webinar training, folks. This is free.
Zoom webinar training. Oh my God. Am I doing it? Am I sharing with you?
We can see it.
Oh my Lord. This is some
You're doing it.
fantastic.
You're doing it there.
All right,
So
let me see if I can make this
Go to the top and hit view and enter full screen, and the whole screen will come up with it.
where's the enter full screen? Fit to window? No.
View, enter full screen, maybe.
I'm supposed to update. Hold on, let me get this go away.
Yeah, that works. You can leave it.
Can
there
you
if
see
want.
it? All right.
Yeah, we can see it. We can see it really well.
All right, great. All right. So I'm just covering state level conservation funds in Pennsylvania. One of the funds that we focus on every year is the Keystone Recreation Parks and Conservation Fund, otherwise known as the Keystone Fund. And you might be saying, all right, well, why as a hunter or an angler is this important to me? Well, the Keystone Fund funds a lot of, a lot of different things, a lot of wildlife habitat, public land acquisition and conservation in Pennsylvania. And the way it works is the funds are generated by setting aside a portion of a percent of the realty transfer tax. And I don't know if I spelled realty right. I feel like I didn't, but anyways, it sets aside a portion of the percent of the realty transfer tax into a state dedicated fund. And that fund is administered by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, otherwise known as DCNR. And DCNR can use the funds for state park and forest infrastructure, conservation, wildlife habitat, public lands acquisition. Well, you can read the slide there. I don't need to go through all of it. And they have a grant program where nonprofits like Ducks Unlimited or Trout Unlimited or other qualifying nonprofit organizations can apply for grants, and the grant matches generally 1-to-1, 50%, and they can use that money for wildlife habitat restoration projects all over the state. I know here in Lancaster County, Donegal Trout Unlimited has used Keystone funds. I think we received, I don't want to overstate it, but I think it was around $30,000 or $40,000 to do restoration work on a wild trout stream here in the northern end of the county. At the time, it wasn't a wild trout stream. It was barely a stock trout stream. But through the restoration work that Trout Unlimited did, this stream has started to recover and now does have wild fish. So there's an example of a type of project that the Keystone Fund can power. Again, portion of a percent of the realty transfer tax set aside in a state coffer, a state fund, a line item in the budget. And what can happen every year during appropriations, that fund can be tapped. It can be, money can be taken from that account and put into the general fund to help balance the budget. And so that's something that we look out for. BHA, ducks, trout. I know I'm missing a bunch of other folks who have helped us out over the years. We all keep an eye on the funds in the Keystone Parks Conservation Fund. All right, so I'm going to go to the other fund that we keep an eye out for, and that's the Environmental Stewardship Fund, the ESF, because it's a mouthful to say Environmental Stewardship Fund all the time. These funds are generated by a tipping fee from out-of-state trash coming into Pennsylvania. So I'm a fly fisherman. I fly fish on the Little Juniata as much as I possibly can. And you'll see these like what seems like miles long trains of trash coming into Pennsylvania from out of state. And so it's trash like that that we put in our landfills. They pay a tipping fee. That fee's, again, put in a state coffer, set aside for environmental projects. The ESF is administered by the Department of Environmental Protection, DEP. And the funds can be used for, I'm just gonna read my slide, even though I was told in all of my community college classes not to read the slide. I'm gonna do it anyways. Protect water quality, restore damaged lands, conserve land and wildlife, revitalize communities, and reinvest in public lands. And that's all true. I hate to go back on, Donegal Trout Unlimited all the time, but that's my experience with these funds. Here in the southern end of Lancaster, we've used environmental stewardship funds to restore a wild trout stream that actually had agricultural impacts coming into it. And we used ESF dollars, matched ESF dollars with funds that we've raised privately and also through donors. Again, 1-to-1 match to do these projects. And I think we got about $30,000 to restore a tributary or portion of Fishing Creek in southern Lancaster County, which, by the way, also helped the farmers on which the land on which the creek flowed meet some of their conservation plans. So benefits agriculture, benefits hunting and fishing. So another important fund that can be utilized by nonprofits in Pennsylvania that we keep an eye on. And again, unfortunately, every year during appropriations, folks, if they got to balance the budget, they're looking around for money that's quote unquote just sitting there, which something to kind of point out that with these funds, you'll hear people say, well, the money's just sitting there. That's not true. I mean, part of that's true, money's sitting there, but that money's dedicated to work that's currently being done, that work that's going to need to be, I forget the term for it and I should know it, but basically the work's done and then the folks who are doing the work submit approval for reimbursement for the work that's being done. So the money's being held and it looks like it's just sitting there doing nothing, but it's actually already being put to work to do these projects. So it's not just sitting there. And that's something that we commonly hear is like, oh, the money's not doing anyone any good, just sitting there. Well, it's not just sitting there. The work's being done. We need to file for reimbursement after the work's done and approved. So, I don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but that's something that you'll hear from time to time and a reason we keep an eye out for these funds. So I'm going to move to the last slide here. And Chris, I know you asked me to cover Marcellus Act 13, and I didn't make a slide for it because I'm awful. I can cover Act 13 if you'd like. I can dip my toe into it, but I don't have a fancy slide to show anyone.
Your call. Maybe just brush up against it. All
right. I have it on my other.
We'll forgive you for not having a slide. It's okay.
All right. So let me just cover this first. PA Conservation Grant Viewer, here's the link to this really cool tool. You can see this little map. There's a screenshot, an awful screenshot that I tried to do of this tool, but this is a tool that was created in collaboration with DCNR and PA Land Trust Association, which is now known as We Conserve PA. And they captured all the Keystone Fund and Environmental Stewardship Fund and Growing Greener and Growing Greener 2 and the Land and Water Conservation Fund projects done throughout the state. There's a couple other state conservation funds that are thrown in there. But if you can look at that map, all those green dots, that's all Keystone Fund projects. I mean, there's just millions upon millions of dollars. And look, if you notice, they're all throughout the state. So these funds touch down in every single community, every single county, every single place across the state, and really do great work for a lot of different folks in our Commonwealth. Act 13, I'm going to transfer it. I don't have a fancy slide, so I'm going to just go to this generic slide. Even though it's not full screen. Man, I'm a technical Luddite. I really am. Act 13 is the Marcellus Legacy Fund. It was created in 2012 to distribute the impact fee for the use of remediation of abandoned mine drainage, abatement, treatment, baseline water quality data program. So that's basically like taking measurements of your water, getting a baseline reading, seeing where water's at. There's some flood mitigation work that's done with Act $13, orphaned and abandoned wells, which there's a lot of throughout Pennsylvania. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think when it comes to abandoned mine issues, Pennsylvania is second in the nation only to Wyoming, I believe. Maybe Chris is nodding, so I hope that I'm on the right track with that. But it's a serious issue in Pennsylvania. So some money set aside in Act 13 for that. One thing that I thought was really cool with Act 13, watershed restoration protection program. We've used Act $13 here in Lancaster to help restore some of our trout streams, trout waters. Where was it here? This part of the program is helping to address waters that are impaired as a result of non-point source pollution, which is a pretty big issue across the state. And we actually have, I think, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I say that a lot because I'm probably wrong a lot. I think 40% of the streams in Pennsylvania are impaired, or is that just Lancaster County? I can't remember. I think Lancaster. Yeah, it's either 30 or 40% of the streams in Pennsylvania are impaired. I should know that off the top of my head, but I always get my Lancaster and Pennsylvania stats mixed up. But we have a.
Can you define a non-point source for us?
Non-point source is trying to think of the best way to define that. So it would be like a non-permitted source of pollution. So let's say a operation has a discharge that's known about, that's discharging pollution into a waterway. That would be a point source pollution. And I hope I'm being accurate here. I feel like somebody who's a lot more knowledgeable than I am will correct me on a technicality here, but non-point source would be, I believe like our farms would qualify as non-point source pollution. So if we have sediment and nutrient load coming into the Chesapeake Bay, trying to think,
it could be multiple sources of different pollution, different sources of pollution.
Right, like runoff from roadways, et cetera. I hope that's being clear.
Yep. You got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So Act 13 is another bucket of funding for conservation that we keep an eye on. So I hope I didn't go over.
No,
that's all I got.
It's perfect.
What do I do now? Stop share.
Good stuff. Yeah. Oh, all right.
Did I do it?
You did. Yeah. You're a natural.
Can I just want to emphasize something that Derek mentioned, and it's directed to the Game Commission. And if you remember what Derek said about how people can often be critical of why are they just sitting on this money, the reason I select the Game Commission is, as those of you who participate in hunting in Pennsylvania know, the hunting license year is July 1st through the following June 30th. So yes, indeed, the Game Commission is taking in a whole lot of money right now, first week of July, but that has to last until June of 2022. So keep those kinds of things in mind when you hear your friends being critical about the amount of money they might have on hand. Thank you.
Okay, great. Anybody want to add anything else to Derek's area there? Yeah, we're good. Okay, we're going to jump to covering federal funding and programs. And Sam, if you don't mind, I think I'll tackle LWCF first, and then we can turn over to you. Sound good? Okay. All right. I do have one slide for this, so share my LWCF slide. Okay. LWCF is a program that's near and dear to BHA's heart. This program started in 1964, and it uses money from offshore, meaning out in the ocean, oil drilling operations. And it was a deal that was struck between the federal government, which technically owns the land those drills are born into, and the pretty much the entirety of the offshore oil business. So in exchange for the right to go out and drill for oil on land owned by the U.S., they agreed to pay money into this fund that would then in turn be used for conservation on land and to secure all kinds of things in the recreation space. It's the primary funding vehicle, one of the most important funding, if not the most important funding vehicle for all kinds of recreation. So it's not just hunting and fishing, public land, wild places, but it's also ballparks, inner city parks, all kinds of playgrounds, swimming pools. You'll find a lot of the swimming pools in towns like Bellefonte and State College and other rural-ish towns around Pennsylvania were all paid for with LWCF money. So anyway, it's been a very important program since the 60s. BHA first started working on LWCF as an issue in 2006 with a fly-in to Washington, D.C. And a fly-in is when you get a whole bunch of your members that are concerned about something and you go all at once to Washington and you sort of blitz the Capitol and everyone talks to their representatives all at once about this singular issue. And so that was our first fly-in on LWCF. I wasn't around then, but a lot of the folks I work with were. So the problem with LWCF was that it had only been authorized for a certain amount of time. I think it was 25 years from 1964, and that ran out. And what that meant was that the program didn't have to continue unless Congress said that it would. So we fought hard along with lots of other people. It wasn't just BHA, lots of individuals, lots of other organizations to get permanent authorization from Congress to make this a permanent program that wouldn't have to go up for authorization every couple of 3 years was what they finally got down to. And it became a fight every time. Then finally, in 2019, we had a big win. Everyone that's a backer of LWCF had a big win when we got permanent authorization from Congress for the program. And a year later, in 2020, we got full funding, which is $900 million a year. And so that $900 million a year had been authorized since 1964. But in the appropriations process in Congress, there was only 1 year that actually all 900 million went into LWCF. The rest of the years, at least a part of the money, and some years a lot of the money got siphoned off for other projects or just put into the federal coffers at large. So now we've made great progress there. So the LWCF is permanently authorized, it's fully funded going forward. And it's broken into two types of where that money goes. There's two buckets, stateside and federal funding. We'll talk about stateside a little bit, and I've already described some of the things that it would pay for, but it's matching funds. Like Derek said, for a lot of the state programs, it's one-to-one match. They're not just giving away the money. You have to come up, the folks that are bringing projects basically have to apply and come up with half the money on their own. But it's matching funds for acquisition, development, redevelopment, and in some cases, planning and studies of public lands in Pennsylvania and all across the U.S. That one of the stats that, or not stats, but facts about LWCF that came out when we're working on it in DC was that there's an almost certainty. I'm not sure who did the work, but that Land and Water Conservation Fund has funded a project in every county in the U.S. So that's how far-reaching and important the program is. Here, it is mainly, I think, entirely used by DCNR for parks and other types of public land use, usually for state parks. When you go to Ricketts Glen, you may see one of these little green logos here, and other places too. Keep your eye out for them, because if you see one of those, it means it was funded by LWCF. Sam, did I cover that? Got anything to add?
No, just the locality of it, like local being locally sourced. We did a whole rally to reach out to our legislatures And I started pulling facts for local funding, and I could find 4 things within a 10-mile radius of my home PA town of where the money's been used. One aspect of it is like the urban application of this. So while most of our game lands are often rural, or state parks can be rural, this money is used in urban areas, which plays an important role in connecting Americans with nature. And that urban mentality, like Philly and Pittsburgh, it's a really big important aspect of this. So while the game lands are funded with conservation dollars, like hunters dollars, the LWCF funds like local green parks and urban parks, which is important too when you're trying to connect all Americans with outdoors.
Yep. Yeah. Right. The boat ramp at Sayers Lake near State College here was funded with LWCF money.
Yeah.
So it's also a type of recreation that, lots of people use a boat ramp. You're not necessarily fishing. It's another connection for all sorts of people, for all sorts of reasons. So, okay, great. You ready to go, Sam? I'll disconnect here and.
Yes, I am going to share a screen, my full screen. I have a PowerPoint. Don't let the slide numbers scare you guys. The reason I have so many is because I'm a visual person. I like pictures. I'll have some charts in here and everything too, but to kind of complement what everything's that's been said so far, I'm talking about federal level funding, and I'll focus on how that money is channeled to our state agencies. It's important to understand that conservation funding is never enough. Our workload is never complete, and there's always a demand for more money to do what we think is best to manage wildlife resources, wild places, and access for people to get those. So where I wanted to start was just 2 bills that I'm going to specifically focus on are Dingell-Johnson and Pittman-Robertson Acts. And they're known by different names, but you'll hear me say PR and DJ. And John referenced those as well too. And it's kind of a narrative that we as hunters and anglers and sports women and men can share as we talk about how we hunt and fish in Pennsylvania. So if anyone's familiar, Ding Darling is an outdoor cartoonist from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. And as I've learned about conservation history, these are the images that helped me understand why we needed conservation dollars. And so 1920s is really where the story I like to start telling about conservation for PR and DJ, specifically PR, Pittman-Robertson Act. Right around the 1920s is when market hunting was a big deal. People were able to harvest something in the field, take it to a local restaurant, be paid for that, and then go out and do it again. So the whole managing of natural resources was really a challenge at that time. We had game agencies. The Pennsylvania Game Commission was founded, I think, in 1885. So we had game agencies, but we still didn't have this whole science behind wildlife management. And so right around the same time, Aldo Leopold, Sand County Almanac was published posthumous, which means after he died, but he was writing a lot of his principles and thoughts into his notebooks around the 1920s and 30s. So right around here is when we started to think about how do we actively manage wildlife conservation and wildlife resource management. So we start on the animal side, the fuzzy, warm-blooded animals, and we'll get to the fish and amphibians and reptiles later. But in 1928, we started to get these like very hyper-focused impact and conversation around what we're doing for wildlife management. So you see Land of Plenty, my old duck slough 25 years ago, the same place today, 25 years later. This is 1928. Then in the 1930s, the actual date wasn't available. We see the same gentleman, Ding Darling, this conservationist who went on to create the first duck stamp, the National Wildlife Federation, like this champion amongst the same names as Gifford Pinchot, who's Pennsylvania famous, Theodore Roosevelt. This is another guy advocating for this information. And he's a part of a team of professionals at the time that advocated for this. There's Carl Shoemaker, some Pennsylvania folks that advocated for this too. And you can start to follow back the history and see where our Pennsylvania roots and conservation and awareness come through. But what a few more duck seasons will do to ducks is kind of the idea, right? You have the buffalo, the wild duck, the dodo bird, the pigeon, passenger pigeon is another example. We know that our impacts as hunters and users of the resource would lead to potentially bad things if we didn't figure out how to manage it. So while the biologists in this up and coming wildlife professional field were evolving, the funding mechanism was being called for too, because we realized that we need money to do work. And so this is one of my favorite images. And it says, this is a theme too. of like the kind of entire PR and DJ story. And the conservation, the title of the caption of the cartoon for this one says, the conservation interests can get what they need if they pull together. This is 1936. Pittman-Robertson Act passed in 1937. So what this kind of displays and communicates is that everyone banded together. You can see ornithologists, mammalogists, women's groups, which played a really fundamental role here too. We weren't just sportswomen, we were gardeners, and the vocal majority in Illinois especially. 4-H clubs are in here, foresters, sportsmen who buy hunting licenses, right? This is showing them descending on the Capitol, very much of how we do it still to this day. We just talked about LWCF, right? When we advocate for funding, we have been successful. This is probably one of our first conservation success stories. So this act was called Pittman-Robertson Act, named for the key two senators that passed it. Carl Shoemaker is another gentleman that rallied the troops, and you can find him in a lot of notes. But in 1937, that act passed. And so I just, a really great person or organization to learn more about these, because we could go on for hours. The Wildlife Restoration Program is the program funded by Pittman-Robertson money. This is a national project managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So here's how this formula works. When I buy a box of shotgun shells or a shotgun itself to go hunting, I pay an excise tax. Now there's certain proportions on the guns and the ammo or the bows that I pay, but that's collected up by the IRS at the federal level and then allocated to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then our state agencies write grants that are approved to make sure they're right in purpose and mission, and that audit and making sure we're using the money wisely. And that's how we get that money for the agencies like the Game Commission that John talked about early on. So on the wildlife side, it's called the Wildlife Restoration Program. You'll see a logo that has a deer in it. If you check out your Game Land Access posts, you'll see wildlife restoration or wildlife sport fish restoration funds paid for access here. So that's one way to capture that. And to tie it back to legislation, that was 1937. Well, let's pivot to the fishing side of things now. In 1950, they said, hey, we want the same thing for the hunting side, from the hunting side for the angling side. And that's how we got the sport fish restoration program. There's a lot of backstory to that too. I'm biased to hunting and shooting, I always have been, but we still have the fish and watering ways conservation that's important too. So the history here is that there's an excise tax on tackle and fishing rods. And so there's a multitude of products that you buy as sportsmen and women and use in the field that fund this conservation. So you'll often hear hunters and anglers fund conservation. Well, this is why. Not just because of our excise taxes, but also because of our license dollars too. And it's important to note, John hinted on it, so I won't go into too much detail, but the number of hunters or anglers we have in our state, in our landmass, dictates how much money we get. And so that's really important to have a vibrant, viable population of participants, so we continue to fund this whole cycle. We user pay all the public benefits is kind of the new phrase to talk about. So just a high gloss idea, wildlife restoration, sport fish restoration, PR, DJ. Here's just a couple key dates. There's been a really great movement called Partner with a Payer that has some awesome videos on it now about striper fishing and waterfowl access in Arkansas. If you're a visual person like I am, again, check this website out. But this also has a great visual because it started off with firearms and ammunition, literally members. So like Olin Winchester and others that had started firearms companies and ammunition companies agreed to have this excise tax passed. Sportsmen also asked for this tax to be passed, and that's how we got started. Then they added in the angling with the DJ in 1950. In the 1970s, the archery industry got involved. So now you pay a % tax on a shaft of an arrow, like 50 cents an arrow shaft, and then also on the components of your archery equipment. And then in 1984, they added the motorboat fuel and marine manufacturing. So a portion of gas tax also goes to this big fund. So on the DJ side, that's paying for your waterways accesses, your boat ramps, your fisheries research, your fish stocking. This is where a lot of that funding comes from. So just some history there, really great website to review. You can dive in, tons of money. This whole image is just to say tons of money since 1939, because it took a couple years to understand how we're actually going to put the money on the ground. Has gone to Pennsylvania and all the states and the territories. That's important too. But just to call it out, John went into this a little bit. You saw how much money came from the feds. You can see right here, federal aid reimbursement at 17% of last year's agency report for the Game Commission. That's where that money is coming back. It's being reimbursed what the agency spends it. You can see how it's going to be complemented by the hunting license sales too. Sport fish restoration, tons, millions coming to Pennsylvania from the angling side of it since 1950. And the images on the left are the same report from Fish and Boat Commission. And then I zoomed in on the top right because you can see how the fish fund is broken out, federal and state grants, and then you can see how the boat fund is broken out, which is important because they have a little bit of a nuance on how they're managed. You can also see how the licensing fees complement that. So the money's coming from a federal level through this cycle and then allocated right on the ground in our state to do much of the work that we've all talked about. So I really want to lean in here, Chris, and I know we're at the 8 o'clock hour, but I think this is really important because there's some future challenges. And we've talked about this money being reserved and set aside. And this is actually notes. I'm a geek on history and conservation, okay, friends? This is meeting notes from one of the regional associations from the Midwest. And it's the first documented time I can find from 1954, where some senator who saw this pot of money that was set aside from conservation dollars and said, we need to allocate this for transportation funds, or we need to go after this money and get it away from the general fund, get away from the reserve fund for conservation and get it into the general fund. And so I just like to highlight, it is a fact that here for the first time we have on record, a high official of the United States has recommended that the PR surplus fund be turned over to the general treasury. The best part about PR and DJ is that we have diversion language. Not only do we have an excise tax dedicated to what we do, which is very unique, we have diversion language in there. So when they wrote this bill and had this pass and then brought it over for DJ in 1952, it was very specific and very intentional and very important. That money of our hunting license sales and of our conservation excise tax dollars has been tried to be diverted, but successfully because of that language, it has not been successful so far. But that was 1954. Just keep this in mind. This is 2017. 2020 had Arkansas facing similar diversion efforts at the state level too. So just because it happened back then doesn't mean that the constant competition for this funding source, we always have to protect it. We always have to advocate for it. So it's just a big kind of portion to highlight here. Another challenge here, I like to bring this up because we predict forward. Wildlife dollars, specifically wildlife dollars, come from the sale of ammunition and firearms. Not all of those sales go straight to hunters. They also go to target shooters. And so this is the current thing agencies are grappling with. When you predict forward and start to look at the trends, you start to see that we started talking about hunters numbers declining, but excise tax dollars going up. And what we recognized was that target shooter numbers were increasing too. And some agencies in recent years have started putting more ranges on the ground. PA is unique. They're one of 3 states that actually have range permits that fund management of those ranges, but not many other states have that. So now one of the current things that we're trying to grapple with is how do we serve target shooters, because they pay for it too. So not only do we serve hunters and anglers and boaters and other outdoor recreationists, but we have target shooters that are literally funding our work, and we're trying to figure out how do we serve them too. So I like this little graphic. Thank a hunter. I was on the staff at Game Commission for about 4 years. I did some of this language too. And now I just say, and a target shooter. Thank a hunter and a target shooter. Thank an angler and a boater. That's who's funding your agencies right now too. So what a few, this is just to reflect back, last point on these funding sources, which again, I think is really important to focus on. We're not away from this period of time. We're losing species, and species are becoming threatened and endangered at a high rate. So the request for money is constant. We are continually on the hill at the state level and at the federal level asking for more money. And our agencies, while trying to do the best they can, need more resources to manage the evolving challenges. So this is still the situation we face, whether it's the 30s or let's say 1930s or 2030, we're going to be in this situation. So right now, there's a great information at 3billionbirds.org just on the disappearance of songbirds. PA, this is really specific why I brought it up, because there's this great disease outbreak with bird feeders. So one source is 100 others to talk about here, but there's facts because we have increasing demand for funding. So as the changing rates of hunters and target shooters, anglers and birders evolve, there's always more species to manage, especially in threatened and endangered, and the workload never changes. So check out these resources. And here's one more quick shout out for RAWA, formerly known as CARA in the 1990s. This is a banner effort where all of our partners try to unite together to ask for more money. RAWA currently stands for Recovering America's Wildlife Act. CARA was the 1990s version that they are trying to get millions and now billions of additional resources channeled through the Pittman-Robertson or Wildlife Sportfish Restoration Program allocated to diversity species management. There's other language we could talk about here, but there is a bill introduced on the House side right now with 81 sponsors trying to get additional money. We have been in pursuit of this funding source for about 3 decades, but it's just a constant thing in our space to be aware of. So as a conservationist, as a hunter, an angler, target shooter, boater in our state, these are the challenges we face. You have a role you play here, not just as a person to play, as somebody said earlier, but to know what the funding sources are and how to advocate on behalf of them. So just wanted to bring that to fruition and know that it's not always secure. I'll stop sharing now, Chris, and if anyone wants to add on, they're more than welcome to.
Well, I think it's now evident why we picked you to do that section.
Yeah.
It's pretty great. Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I don't know that I have too much to add except for RAWA is a thing that's coming. It's been coming for a while, and I know BHA's, we've had our eye on it and have worked behind the scenes on it a lot, but we haven't really done a whole lot up front yet because we're not sure quite if it's time to dig in with both feet. There will be a time when it is, I hope, soon. And really advocate hard for that. When we get there, we'll be calling on our members and others to advocate for WildWild, because that money will help. It's not just game funding, right? It's not just game animals. It's all kinds of species. And when you work on a project to, lift up a salamander or some other little critter that nobody thinks about that's about to go extinct, the byproduct of that is usually helping a whole lot of other things in that same environment. You can't just signal out one thing. So you might be helping a salamander or some strange fish that no one's ever seen that only comes out once a year at night. But when we help those species, we lift up entire ecosystems sometimes. And
For sure.
That's one of the things another reason that RAWA is really important.
Yeah, and PR dollars technically and DJ dollars can be spent on, we'll call them non-game, not your elk and deer, right? It's just challenging. The agencies in RAWA might not pass this year, might pass in a different version next year, right? It's just an idea to highlight that there's a demanding increase in need for resources.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And Game Commission is responsible for, what is it, 327 species or how many?
462, but I worked
462.
There so yeah,
I was close. 462 species, and we hunt like, I don't know, 28 of them or something. So yeah, they actually do a lot of work on non-game already, as do state agencies across the U.S. and elsewhere. So.
For sure.
I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I think as I look back on the last 3 years working for TRCP, one of the things that came up this year that I thought was interesting was in our meeting with state level lawmakers, we had a lot of people asking us, and John can speak to this too, a lot of people were asking us when they consider moving the state funds like the Keystone Fund or the Environmental Stewardship Fund, what do we stand to lose from federal dollars? And wanting to understand that. And what Sam just went through is a perfect example of there's some federal dollars that, the Keystone Fund and the Environmental Stewardship Fund can from time to time use to leverage for public land acquisition. So like whether that's Keystone money being presented to a land trust and that land trust working with the Game Commission to acquire, say, something like the Klondike property in Goldsboro, Pennsylvania. There was 500 acres of land that was acquired through, I believe it was the Keystone Fund, with help from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Remember, those state funds have to be matched 1-to-1, so there had to be another funding source. Right. And I'd have to go back and double check, but I'm pretty sure the Game Commission came up with the matching, or it was Wildlands Conservancy. Thank you. Sorry, the Wildlands Conservancy came up with that. But those funds can be used together, and it's important for us to understand how federal dollars are coming down into the state, and the state dollars are also leveraging federal funds and local funds as well. It all ties together when we're talking about these projects.
Absolutely, yeah, important stuff. And also, as Sam mentioned, the Pittman Robertson, Dangle Johnson money that comes back into the Commonwealth has a direct tie to the number of of the licenses that are sold. That sort of stuff, you can't forget that stuff. And legislators and other policymakers in Harrisburg and other state capitals need to know that. That's one of the things that Backcountry tries to stay on top of and remind people of.
For sure. And just in general about funding matching and everything, PR and DJ have a 75% federal, 25% non-federal match. And within that language, you can use in-kind dollars. So a great resource up until recently has been volunteer higher ed instructor hours. We figured out how to put a valuation of per hour on that, and there'd be millions of dollars coming in. And the Game Commission specifically used that money to pay for the National Archery in the Schools program, the Hunter Education program. So like there is this, while written in 1937 and 1950, we have been able to evolve it to help accommodate kind of growing needs. So I guess I might have made a comment about Rama maybe not passing this year, but I think the whole reason behind this is to just keep advocating for it. And I think one of the questions coming up is, how does the average conservationist do this? Keep advocating for it. Keep this a priority and keep this on the radar for people. Because if it doesn't pass this year, it'll pass next year. And if not next year, we'll keep working on it.
Yeah, good point. We're at 8:10, so we're already over time. I think we should take a few questions. We got some questions coming in here. I think we'll go in order. And Harry has asked us, does the group have a sense of how the pandemic and shortfall in state budgets will influence these funds for wildlife and conservation?
I'd like to address that one. You're absolutely right, and that the pandemic has had, I don't have to explain to anybody, we've all had some kind of impact, and it certainly has hit state budgets. But what I'd like to do is answer that question by going right to question number 2, which is an advocate for conservation funding. And what I try to do in Harrisburg is to remind lawmakers and policymakers how the pandemic, this goes back to what I said early on in this webinar, was how it's affected people's desire to be outdoors. And so and I think everybody knows that. For heaven's sakes, we had a couple of state parks that actually had to close their borders to keep people out because the numbers were getting so high. So yes, Harry's question about the funds for wildlife and conservation, they're often seen as a target, or pirate is the word that I use, Sam, when you were talking about taking money, to take money away. But to answer the anonymous attendees question, to make your voices heard, remind your policymakers and your legislators just how this pandemic has caused all of us to want to get outside and enjoy the outdoors. Bicycle sales, kayaks, fishing, hunting, all those outdoor pursuits, and everybody, that resonates with everybody, including lawmakers.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on that, DCNR, again, has $1 billion backlog in infrastructure in the state parks and forests, and that was before the pandemic. That's before many of the parks saw 100, 200% increases in visitation. Beltsville, in particular, was one of the most heavily used parks in the eastern part of the state that saw over 400% visitation increase over. So $1 billion backlog before everyone headed outdoors and put an even greater strain on the state parks, forest resources.
And in general, something not just on the budget side of it, because license sales went up. Like, let's recognize that too. For the first time in 3 decades on the hunting side, a national increase of 5%, right? And depending on your numbers and certifications and stuff, participation's up for once in the lifetime. And angling too. Angling is up 20-some%, right? Target shooting is up millions. We have so many new target shooters there. So yes, there's more people, but that balance of how we have increased revenue. And I guess it's important to point out that just because you have money doesn't mean you can spend it on certain things you need to spend it on. And either having the budget authority, which is another big component of this, just because you have it sitting in your coffer doesn't mean the governor is going to give our agencies the ability to actually spend it. Because if they can spend money, that doesn't mean our other departments can. So it's just this really nuanced situation, because just because they have the money doesn't mean they can spend it, but they still have growing demand. So One little plug, if everything else was digital in our state, like pink envelopes, we would be even better off too. So just throwing that out there.
I want to dig in a little bit on the question about what can an individual do, just so we're sure that we answered that. If you, as an individual, all the big impacts happen, in advocacy because a lot of individuals banded together and made their voices heard cumulatively or, together. And I think join BHA, join Trout Unlimited, join TRCP, join any conservation group, join Audubon. I mean, it doesn't matter. Join all of them if you can, but pick a few, because part of what those organizations do is inform their members when something is coming down the pike where advocacy may be needed. So that's the first thing is to know when to act by being in touch. And the second thing is, pick up the phone, write a letter, send an email. Those organizations will give you tools that help you. But probably the most important thing to do, and John will back me up on this, I think, is pick up the phone and call your legislators' offices and talk to them. Let them know how you feel about an issue. They get calls like that all day long. They have an impact. They're not, it is the single best way for an individual person to make it. You could also go meet with them. I mean, they represent you. It's their job to sit down and talk to you. And I think you'll find that most of them will do that.
Sure.
It
is indeed. And like I said, use the pandemic as an example, because everybody who's been paying attention for the last year and a half knows how important the outdoors and recreational activity is and was used, including legislators.
And
so go ahead, Derek.
I was going to say, and John can attest to this too. It doesn't take much. An email for some offices, if they receive 3 or 4 emails on an issue, they go, holy smokes, something's happening. Something's going on here and I got to pay attention. It doesn't take much. It doesn't always have to be, hundreds of people. And it really adds up. So, I mean, don't discredit the difference that you can make by reaching out via email. Phone calls are even better. And definitely visiting in the office is really great.
Yeah, that's great.
Just real quick, in the age of Zoom, it's important, but if you are more than a little average, if you have ability to collect some of your friends together and do a group call as well from a similar jurisdiction of a rep or a senator, there's leverage and power in that too, because more bodies showing up and engaged and professional. If you have that higher level ability to do that coordination work, that's more powerful too. So just don't think you have to operate alone. There's often somebody that'll come along and sit in the room with you. So definitely leverage out to your advantage too. You can do all the talking, just have them sit and look pretty. It's great.
Yeah. And I'll just wrap up answering that question. Like just get involved. Join a nonprofit, run for office. Write a letter to the editor. Do for your newspaper. Do anything you can to let your views be known on conservation issues. Because one thing we hear all too often is that we're not hearing from the hunters and anglers. We're hearing from these other groups, but we're not hearing from them. And sometimes I'm not sure it's true, but we're going to take them at their word. So we want to make sure that we're being as vocal as possible, and that means everybody picking up the phone.
You're spot on too. And I mean, and with going into the fall, with some of the other negotiations, conversations going on, that's really important to remember that, come budget season, a lot of people are coming with their needs, with their wants, and that's great. That's part of our process, right? But we got to make sure we're there too. And if you're, it's just important to make sure that we're heard equally, if not louder, where we can.
We're pretty far past our time here. We're going to take one more question from Don Rank, who asked, since the Keystone Fund depends on realty transactions and the ESF depends on trash transport, are those sources largely inconsistent in terms of dollar amounts? I think what he's asking is, does the ups and downs of those markets affect the dollars?
Absolutely. And so it's great that you bring that up. In the previous to last year before pre-pandemic, if you'll indulge me with that term. Keystone funds, realty transfers weren't as high as as they were, as folks were hoping. And then here along comes the pandemic, and we saw an increase, pretty significant increase in realty transfer in Pennsylvania. And so the Keystone Fund is doing better than it has. And that's a great point, Don, that you bring up, where offices will say that. They'll say, well, hey, the Keystone Fund is doing really good right now. You won't mind if we skim a little off the top here and put that over in the general fund. And to your point about how it fluctuates, it's doing good right now, but it wasn't doing so great a couple of years ago. So we kind of see this as, well, it's making up space, that we, some ground that we lost in years prior. And you know what? It's a good high water mark for maybe the realty transfers aren't going to do so good in the next coming year. So that's a great point about the fluctuation. Sometimes that's used as a talking point or a reason to take a little bit more off the top. And those funds do fluctuate. And I think the tipping fee, I believe, has stayed pretty consistent. I seem to remember, I don't want to be telling tales out of school or anything, but I think some folks had considered maybe increasing the tipping fee to try to generate a little bit more. But maybe I'm imagining that. But Don, that's a great question. That yes, it fluctuates, and sometimes when it's doing well, that is used as a reason to take a little off the top. And we see that from where we stand as making up for maybe underperforming in years prior.
One more quick question here from Matthew that I didn't see till just now. Is there any money that comes from hikers that use the same lands as hunters and fishermen or women? Go, Samantha.
There is not an excise tax on any other equipment used to recreate outdoors aside from the things we identified, but there could be a backpack tax in the future. Just like Rawa had Kara in the 90s, there's been a conversation about backpack taxes, binocular taxes, birdseed taxes, etc. Because people bird watch, and when they're out there traipsing on the land too, they're having an impact just as much as hunters are too. So in PA, the funding source from the majority of the game lands is hunters' dollars, target shooters excise taxes, and hunters excise taxes too. And then on the fish and boat side, I'd look to John Klein to identify that specifically.
Well, yeah, it's true. And in fact, to that question, there was a task force put together by the Game Commission several years ago. I don't think it amounted really to much, but they were addressing questions like damage caused to state game land trails, and there was a recognition by the Game Commission that people who don't state game lands are open to the public for any legal outdoor recreation use, hiking, fishing, bird watching, and other pursuits. And your question is good. Whoever asked that, we certainly want hikers to continue to use that land, but it's something to keep in mind in your discussion, because it's the people really that hunt and fish that are carrying most of the load.
Yeah, and the sort of the catch-all term for a tax that would maybe pull an excise from other things is called a backpack tax. So that would cover not just backpacks, right, but tents, hiking boots, tent stakes, lanterns, maybe, like, who knows? It would have to all be negotiated, right?
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Georgia did the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Act, GOSA.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good call.
I believe that was something that was passed on referendum, and it allocated a portion of the sales tax on outdoor recreation equipment to go to a dedicated conservation fund. And it passed in Georgia.
Recently, last couple of years.
Yeah, within I think it was 2018 or something like that. So check that out. I think it's called the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Act, and I think now the name is something else. It's GOSA. But there you go. That's something to consider as a way to generate dedicated conservation funding.
Yeah, 0.5% of an existing sales tax. was pulled from a certain list of products. Yeah, that's a good call. That slipped my mind. I was thinking more on a federal level. There was a federal bill
19.
in the 90s.
Mhm.
Yeah, that failed. That it would have created an excise tax on, you know, the backpack tax, as they call it. But it didn't make it. So yeah, that's a great question.
And state level, state by state, there is state allocated tax dollars or excise tax dollars at the state level, like Georgia. Missouri is another state that gets like 1/2 of 1 cent or something. And there's about 5 to 6 out of the 50 states that have something like that now.
Great. All right, we're going to let Don Rank take us out with one more question. Who pays for the Coyote Mountain Lion stocking program? Is that just license fee dollars, or can PR funds be used?
I heard it's the governor's fund. I don't know though.
Could be. We'll have to get Brian Burhans from the Game Commission to come and answer that question. We don't know. We don't know the answer, Don. Sorry. For those of you who may not be in the know, there is no Coyote or Mountain Lion stocking program in Pennsylvania.
What about the jackalope?
But a lot of people believe that there is. The jackalope's out west.
What about the jackalope?
That's Wyoming.
Dude, I for sure remember my my pap having a jackalope mounted in his basement next to his reloading bench.
Everybody's pap had one.
I'm sure he said that was a native wild Pennsylvania jackalope.
Yeah, it could have been. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. We were almost a half hour over, but you know, considering all the information we delivered, I think that's not too bad. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We really do appreciate it. I want to thank Derek and Samantha and John for the time, their expertise, and their dedication to conservation, hunting and fishing, public lands, wild places, all the stuff we love. Again, thank you all for being here. If anyone has any follow-up questions after this, please feel free to reach out. You can find me on the BHA website, and I'll get your question to any of these folks if necessary. And keep your eyes out for this program. We're going to be doing more of these on different topics, you know, occasionally as we move forward here. And we also have a companion program that is aimed at helping people who are new to hunting specifically, called the Become a Pennsylvania Hunter program. We've got another program, a virtual program next week on that. You can find it on the BHA website at backcountryhunters.org, and you can sign up for that and join us for that. And then we're going to have a series of live deer scouting events at spots throughout Pennsylvania coming up this summer. The first one's July 21st. July 25th. July 21st is my birthday. I automatically just went there. No, it's July 25th. And then we're scheduling more of those every week. And then also coming up will be a series of butchering clinics. Want to learn how to butcher a deer on your own. We're gonna put on a whole bunch of those. So anyway, thank you all for joining us. We do appreciate it, and we're out.